What sets journalists apart from others who create content are the laws that we're governed by and the ethics and the standards that we operate under. But let's talk about ethics a little bit. Ethics is a little more nuanced than law, oftentimes, and it is not governed by law. Ethics are the standards under which any profession operates, and we have personal ethics too, of course, but the ethics of journalism is what we're going to talk about. This story may seem familiar. The U.S. Border Patrol found the bodies of several people, including 3 children, along the Rio Grande in Texas, right down in the valley. And this story, as difficult as it is, carried a number of ethical issues with it. And one of them was, do you use the photos? On the one hand, we take the photos always. If we're there, we take photos because you can't go back and change your mind to take it later. So we do take photos, but then we decide what will we do with them. Will we run them? How do we display them? And so there were a number of good stories about whether or not the photos of the bodies should be shown. A number of publications did show them and then explained why. And in fact, the Pointer did this very good article about it and about the impact of such images. And they also use the photo, but as you'll see at the top of their story, it says, you can see the photo this column references by scrolling to the end of the story. So the Pointer itself, which is a journalism education institute that does a lot with ethics, they made a decision based on ethics not to put that photo right at the top of the web page when you got to it, but instead to warn you that it is down lower, and if you want to see it, you can go there and see it. And if you don't want to see it, perhaps don't scroll to the bottom. So we make these kinds of decisions all the time. For your project, you will have a law and ethics paper to do where you reflect upon some of the decisions that you make. And from my perspective, every time a journalist makes any decision, ethics comes into play. When you decide to make a call and choose this one source, that's a decision that you have made that has to do with ethics. It has to do with truth and accountability. So what you're going to do for your law and ethics paper is you're going to write 1 page. It can be 5 pages, but 1 page is generally sufficient, a single-spaced page where you look at the specifics of the Code of Ethics, the SPJ Code of Ethics we'll use as our guide, and explain what ethical decisions, ethical concerns that came into play with your project, and you'll cite specific parts of the Code of Ethics. And then you'll also refer to matters of law. You may cite specific law, that's wonderful, but in general I want you to be able to at least identify the issues that come up with law. And we will talk more about this in class. This image from the first slide may look a little puzzling, but this is some research that was done in part with Facebook as they looked at what communities are covered by journalists, right? Like where is news being provided to a community? And if you look at this map, realize that the areas that are white or the lighter colors means that there are not enough news outlets in these areas. There's not enough local news being reported that Facebook would be able to launch one of their products that they're working on, which is called Today, right, where they're aggregating news. So these are news deserts. There are whole swaths of the United States where there is not local reporting. There is not a journalism organization holding government accountable. And that's a concern, right? That's an ethical concern about how we perform that watchdog role when the business of journalism is a little challenged right now. So something to think about is this is the Austin-San Antonio corridor right here. And if you look at this corridor, you'll see that the darker counties, the lower one being Bexar County, San Antonio, the upper ones being Travis County, is there are news outlets, right? These counties, and it includes Hays County as you go up I-35, there are news outlets here, but just one county on either side of most of these counties, there's not a consistent local news source, which means all of these white counties, these white squares in Texas, every one of them has a county government. Every one of them has law enforcement. Every one of them has representation in the legislature. And so who holds those government officials who are doing the people's business? Who holds them accountable? Here's another issue. So much content produced online. This is a media website, WFAA, which is a TV station out of Dallas. But is this story news? If we look at it in its sort of format, it looks like news. It's on a news website. It has sort of that look of, shorter paragraphs. And the lead is, if you were considering a move and could take your pick of any state in the U.S. to move to, you'd probably choose Florida. If not there, you'd likely pick some other state in the Southeast, according to a new study by LendingTree, the parent company of Magnify Money. Now, we cite companies and their research from time to time in stories, but one of the ways you might question this is because the main source is LendingTree, and they attribute that in the lead. But let's look at this byline. This byline says that Brittany, where we would normally see Brittany with WFAA TV, says Magnify Money and Tegna, right? So Brittany works for Magnify Money and Tegna, which is the parent company of WFAA. What a number of media outlets are doing to try to sort of make ends meet and generate business is they have created marketing content creation departments where they will write stories that mimic news, and the companies pay to have them published on the website. Now, normally they say something like sponsored content or branded content. This is not as clear. This assumes that you know that by listing Magnify Money, that's who Brittany reports to. But it is not that clear for the average news consumer. Here's another one. So the FDA, this is a pretty, it happens, right? Doesn't happen every day, but it is becoming more common. So the FDA has some information that they want to release. There are by far many more PR professionals than there are journalists in the world. And so the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, had a proposal that they would permit news outlets to have this scoop, but you could only quote the approved sources that the FDA provided. And that makes journalists uncomfortable. When somebody outside of our news organization is making news judgments, making news decisions for us, that makes us uncomfortable because we are accountable to the public, not to stakeholders like the FDA. So what happened? What did NPR do? Here's the paragraph. NPR took the deal. I'll be at the briefing, Stein wrote. Later that day, in April of 2014, Stein, along with reporters from more than a dozen other top-tier media organizations, including CBS, NBC, CNN, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times, showed up at a federal building to get this reward, right? That every single journalist present agreed not to ask any questions of sources not approved by the government until given the go-ahead. Makes me uncomfortable. The question is, do you not get the information, not report it? You would eventually get the information. You would be behind the other people that took the deal. These are difficult decisions to make. But again, this one makes me uncomfortable. The other thing, another area of ethics that we think about is how we identify sources. We've talked a little bit about that, but often we're on deadline when we have to make these calls. And so there are a number of organizations, the Pointer being one of them, specific journalism organizations that will often step up and put information out to journalists when something happens that is a spot news event and there needs to be some clarification. It's like, here's some resources for you right now. And unfortunately, it happens more and more with mass shootings. So when the shooting in Orlando happened, the National Association of LGBTQ journalists put out a statement that said, like, here's some information that you should use as a journalist. Don't assume someone's sexual orientation. If it's germane to the story, likely in covering the Orlando shooting, ask how the person identifies, as we've discussed in class. Don't assume someone's gender identity. Don't use gay to include lesbian. Don't use homosexual, right? Here's some very good basics that we can feel a little uncomfortable when we don't know how to handle that correctly. So look for these resources. So we'll do this in class, but I want you to take a moment before class to put a little thought into that. What are some of the ethical issues you've encountered, and what are some of the legal issues you've encountered with your project? Think about these areas. Are there issues with copyright? The photos that you have and any other content that you're going to publish? Are there issues with source ID, source diversity, source credibility and accuracy? Does your source know what they're talking about? Have you checked and double checked that information? Do you have a situation where there's no comment or no response from somebody you really need? Do you have multiple perspectives? Do you have personal bias that can affect this story that you need to be aware of? Do you have access to report what you're trying to report with your project? Do you have access to records? Is there any potential for libel? Were you able to record audio and video? Was that an issue in any of your interviews? Are there privacy concerns? Several of the projects potentially have privacy concerns. Are any of the projects dealing with trauma? And trauma is a complex issue. It's obviously trauma involving the people we're talking to sometimes, but it also can be a trauma for journalists to have to report on some of these situations. So in SPJ, the Code of Ethics, we have these 4 main premises: seek the truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, be accountable, and transparent. The SPJ Code of Ethics is sort of the grandfather of the Code of Ethics. It was created long ago by the Society of Professional Journalists, then called Sigma Delta Chi, and it became the standard for other media organizations to adopt. Some simply adopt the Code of Ethics from SPJ. Others use this as the basis for creating their own code. The Code of Ethics has, aside from that sort of simple one-page look, now online there are these extra little icons here that actually give you more information behind this. So diligently seek subjects of news coverage to allow them to respond to criticism or allegations. And then there is this little icon you can click on it. It gives you much more information about that specific topic. The NPR is one organization that has a really robust Code of Ethics, again, sort of based on the SPJ Code of Ethics. But if you go and look at their website, where we used to have just this whole book printed out, and SPJ has this one page, but there's so much more, obviously. So there's so much more behind that one page. So all of these areas are covered by the NPR Code of Ethics: accuracy, fairness, completeness, honesty, independence, and such. And then from there, there's more and more that you can go to. There's also this section called Memos, and there's an ombudsman who writes about the ethics of NPR in situations that they encounter. And so this can be really helpful if we keep up with some of this, because this is what we do as professionals, right? We consider what is going on in our profession and how can we build our knowledge base so that we can make sound ethical decisions. And this is guidance for the 4th, like the 4th of July. Beware of videos and other things that go viral. It's likely that there will be things happening on and around the National Mall tomorrow that will lead to videos, tweets, photos, and other social media reports that go viral. Here are some reminders from an earlier post. We don't necessarily have to report about them until we have more to say than other than that they exist. One video, tweet, etc. may not tell a complete story. It is very likely we won't know how it was edited. We may know nothing more than about the motivation of the person who made the video. We may know nothing about the motivations of the person who posted the video. So this is really good perspective, especially because we're doing so much of this on deadline. So if you've already read this and you have this in your head, this will help you make good decisions. This is the Texas Tribune Code of Ethics, and so I've linked this for you as well. The Texas Tribune has a very detailed Code of Ethics, and as a nonprofit news organization, one of the things that they do is they practice transparency. Transparency in their reporting to tell you where their information came from, but also transparency in their business of how they collect news and how they pay as a business, how they pay for this business of journalism as a nonprofit. And so they have their annual report, their 990 tax forms going back a number of years. Transparency helps your audience have faith in you. It helps build credibility.